The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act broke the barriers of generalized education for the disabled and focused instead on individualized education. As the IDEA focused on individuals, it created more equitable education systems, which gave special education students tools to become successful in society and provided them with necessary rights. Before 1975, disabled children were not integrated in classrooms with so-called normal children. Children with disabilities either stayed home or were sent to institutions supposedly designed for their education. However, these education services did not support these children's needs.
Um, Children with disabilities were often housed at institutions because unless you were a family that had the ability to take care of your child at home, or you had the money to put them in a private school, the public school wasn't taking them. So you had, children who were not provided with services. They were put in warehouses, basically.
Any good programs that could have been out there would have been very difficult to find. They cost money that most people didn't have. These times considered education for the disabled a privilege, not a right. Most of the time, good programs were simply not available to these kids in need. The only community integration of the disabled was for children with mild impairments. Any child who had even moderate disabilities were cast away from the regular classroom. Barriers on disabled children's education was the only thing that was known at the time. These children had no interaction with regular students. Disabled children were treated as if they had no purpose, that they had no ability to learn or grow in a community. Society had given up on them and deemed them unteachable. However, the 1960s and 70s brought new attention to human rights. With civil rights movements focused on racial and women's equality, equal rights were on the forefront of many minds. People started to fight for the equal rights of those with disabilities, especially in education services, which brought new government attention. People started to sue organizations that declined basic rights to the disabled. There were many cases that forced the government into the passing of this act. Examples of these cases consist of Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Mills versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia. This provided more legal pressure, pushing community integration of the disabled into an act. As of 1970, only 1 out of 5 children with disabilities were integrated in school. This all changed with the Education of All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, later renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act as of 1991, after the term handicapped was decided to be an inappropriate description of the disabled. Originally passed in 1975, the EAHCA granted those with disabilities rights to their education. This first part of changing the law in special education was successful, with high school graduations of the disabled going up by 14% from 1984 to 1997. However, more rights needed to be added to this act. It also needed a name change because of its inappropriate word choice, as it called disabled persons handicapped, which was considered offensive. This changed the name of the EAHCA to the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was passed in 1991. This act specialized in the individual care of education of those with disabilities, and the name change put the person before the disability. Education systems for the disabled before this act were paralleled to the education systems of non-disabled children, when in fact disabled children need education systems that are fit to their needs. They need individualized education that doesn't just fit the mold of a normal school education. It was meant to take away the generalized education for the disabled and focus instead on individualized education. Putting the individual before their disability reminded people not just to see a disabled person's disadvantages, but to see that they were a person as equal as anyone else. The IDEA has 4 main sections to it, each proclaiming a different set of rules for different situations. Part A consists of the basic foundation of the Act. Part B lies down the educational guidelines of the Act. Part C recognizes the need for support in kids with disabilities from birth till 3, which may clear up any problems that a child might have at an early age. And Part D describes national activities that will carry out the Act. It also contains 6 major rights of a disabled person's education in those 4 main sections. They consist of free appropriate public education, or FAPE, appropriate evaluation, individualized education plan, or an IEP, least restrictive environments, parent participation, and procedural safety guards. FAPE states that education systems should be designed to a child's unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. It was implemented to make sure that children had meaningful education that benefits kids instead of just forcing knowledge on them that they don't understand. It says it in the name, free, appropriate public education. This also takes away the harsh payments that parents have to pay for their children to get the education they deserve. Appropriate evaluation requires schools to evaluate children who are suspected to have disabilities differently and more accurately. It requires a team of professionals to assess the child with the proper tools and procedures. These assessments also must be done on a non-discriminatory basis, and they must be done in an appropriate amount of time related to the time they are suspected to have a disability. The IEP was created for the IDEA to make sure that children were able to access FAPE. It took down the restrictions of what generalized education was. It was kind of a continuation that enhanced the effects of FAPE. It uses previous assessment information of a child to create a unique and appropriate education plan for that child. It prevents the educational performance of a child, their benchmark goals, services and/or other aids that the child may need, and details on where the child is not performing up to the set standard. It reports on the education of a child and further reports on their transition into adulthood. It covers birth to 21. This means that a child who may not have been able to go to college now has that opportunity. The LRE helps with the placement of children in a general classroom, breaking the barriers of the isolation of special ed students. It makes sure that when placed in a general classroom, they are at their least restrictive environment. This may include classroom modifications, supplemental aids and services, and/or alternative instructional methods. This means that if a child can spend 20% of their time in a normal classroom, they have the right to. If they can spend an entire day with regular ed students, they have the right to, if it is at their least restrictive environment. The IEP team looks at a child and determines if they are able to be effectively educated in a general classroom setting. If they are not capable of being in a general classroom at all, the IEP team must make incredible efforts to decide a LRE not in as general of a classroom. Parent participation implements the parents into making decisions for their child, specifically in placement. Parents have equal participation and have the right to access any planning needs for their child. They also have the right to deny any further evaluation of their child. Finally, procedural safety guards help parents enforce the rights of their children safely and accurately. They also protect parental access to their child's needs regarding their placement. The IDEA was the force that broke through the barriers of institutionalizing and excluding children who aren't the same as the mold of what a child was expected to grow into. It not only deinstitutionalized students, but included them and gave them the best education possible. So, with the IDEA put into action and further amendments added to it in 2004 that shifted the funding away from special education and into general education to include special education students into classrooms with their peers to provide them with their least restrictive environment, it brought less isolation. Special education students gain rights that legally gave them a foundation to their appropriate education. Parents need a legal framework to demand their children's legal rights. This allows children to grow into the full potential that they have. It gives them the tools and options to be successful in the world. All people deserve equal rights. For too long, people with special needs were checked away. For too long, they got much less than what they needed. For too long, education was seen as a privilege. Newsflash, education should not be seen as a privilege, and the IDEA put that into practice. Everyone deserves the right to an education. So the IDEA broke the barriers of generalized education that the EAHCA did not handle and focused instead on individualized education. The EAHCA wasn't enough, and people needed the push of the IDEA to finally give what was deserved. People are often focused on equality, but equity is also very important. Before 1975, disabled children were not treated equally. However, before 1991, disabled children weren't treated equitably either. Although equality was a big step, and a very important one at that, the IDEA brought equitable education systems to fit the needs of disabled persons. The IDEA broke barriers for disabled people in not only education, but in how the world should see them.